All right, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. Hello and welcome to our panel on bisexual visibility in research and academia. Just to go over a few housekeeping rules. The webinar will be recorded and shared with everyone who registered, so don't worry, you will see this again if you miss any part today. We will have time at the end for any audience questions. So please submit your questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we would love your feedback. So if you could please submit feedback in the form included in the follow-up email that will come after this talk. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you. And our wonderful panel today, I'm very excited to introduce. First, I'll start with myself. Hi, I'm Julia Slater. I will be your moderator today. For accessibility, I am a woman wearing a bedazzled black shirt and eyeglasses with short brown hair and a nose piercing. I am also the publishing editor of Gender and Society and other social science journals. I'm a member of the US LGBTQ ERG, and I'm a co-lead of the US Gender Equity ERG. But enough about me. I'm delighted to introduce today's panelists, and we are going to go in alphabetical order. So Paz Gallupo, can you please introduce yourself? Rosie and Surya Monro, can you please come and say hello to everyone? Paz, would you like to begin?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Paz Gallupo. I just finished 27 years as a faculty member at Towson University, and I'm beginning this month as a faculty member at Washington University in St. Louis. My research has focused historically on bi and pan populations, as well as non-binary conceptualizations of both sexual orientation and gender identity. I am currently the editor for journal Bisexuality, which is an interdisciplinary journal, academic journal that focuses on publishing the newest bisexual literature. So I'm excited to share space with all of you. My pronouns are they and she. For accessibility reasons, I am a biracial, bisexual participant whom is white presenting with asymmetrical hair, and I'm wearing reading glasses because I'm in that age group now. And I'm excited to share space with all of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Paz. Rosie, would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. My name is Rosie Nelson. I use they, them pronouns. I'm white with very messy brown hair and giant gold hoops. Those are my defining features right now. And I am a lecturer in gender at the University of Bristol. I'm a sociologist in my approach to gender and sexuality. And my research interests focus around bisexuality, LGBTQ identities more broadly, with also a particular focus on trans and non-binary identities. And I am also very interested and invested in qualitative research methods, which is where people's eyes tend to glaze over, but I'm a big nerd for it.
Oh, thank you, Rosie. And Surya, last but not least, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Professor Surya Monro. I'm based in the UK at present at the University of Huddersfield. I use she, sometimes they pronouns for accessibility purposes. I appear female sometimes, mostly. I've got short dark hair. I'm Caucasian. And at the moment I'm not wearing reading glasses, but sometimes I do. And thrilled to be here with you today and really hope you enjoy this session. In terms of my background, I started off doing research about transgender back in the 90s and published quite a lot in that area. I've published around citizenship and LGBT equalities more broadly and around intersectionality. And at the moment, I'm working on a lot of research about intersex people's human rights and well-being with intersex colleagues and others, international work, mostly funded by the European Commission. In terms of bisexuality, I researched and published a book about bisexuality in 2015, and also did a sort of archaeological dig through social research, looking at the way that intersex people have been erased. And that was quite a painful process because, of course, as a bi or pansexual person myself, I've also experienced being marginalised, erased and overlooked. So I'm really very pleased to be at this panel today, and I hope we can have some interesting discussions.
Thank you so much. All right, so we're going to get started and go right into our questions and discussion. So number one, which we've already brought up a little bit, intersectionality plays a crucial role in understanding the experiences of bisexual individuals. How do you navigate and address the intersections of your identity, sexuality, and scholarship in your work? Does anyone want to start?
I'm happy to go first. So from a scholarship perspective, intersectionality is, of course, a central concern in any conversations around sexuality and gender, because, you know, as we know from lots of previous existing research, our experiences of gender and sexuality are so variously defined based on all of our other experiences that we're bringing to the table. So in my own research, which I will say is very based on sort of Western contexts, particularly UK, US, Canada, and Australia. And I specifically delimit it in that way because I am very invested in how people who use bisexual, pansexual, or queer, or any other multi-gendered label as an identity format. And that doesn't always necessarily translate in international context. So that's already one decision that I'm making in terms of how intersectional my research is and where it speaks to. But I think it's really integral to think about gender and the relationship to bi plus identities in one way or another, not only because there's so little research related to bi plus identities that isn't focused on cis women, but also because we know that there are very different social reactions to bi people of different genders. And of course, if you're adding in additional currents of discrimination related to transphobia and so on, then there's a lot of different implications of that lived experience. I could talk a lot about intersectionality, but as it relates to my work, then I have a significant focus on gender, class, and increasingly race and ethnicity related to bi plus identities and the sort of lived experience of that, because we know it to be very different across a lot of those different spaces.
Thank you, Rosie. That was very comprehensive, and I'd like to pick up the point about you know, the location of our research, because I think as social scientists, it's so important, isn't it, to situate ourselves culturally and in terms of the countries that we're based in and so on. And so, you know, yes, I'm also Western originated, but I've done some research in the global South, and I think it is really important to flag up straight away that the notion of bisexuality is a Western construct, of course, as is pansexuality, and that the LGBT terminologies are used or rejected in lots of different ways in different global South contexts. So, for example, I did some research in India with an Indian colleague, and we found that there was a tendency, which I'm sure many of you are already aware of, for these Western originated labels to be used in urban centres amongst people who are wealthier, more upper caste people or moneyed people, and for people in the more rural and poorer locations, not to use them and to reject them, and to use you know, the very many different social constructs of identity that have developed within an Indian context, where gender diversity goes back many thousands of years. It's been recorded for many thousands of years. So there are many different configurations. And I think that's very important in understanding that what we do, you know, is deeply affected by our histories and by the country that we live in. And I also could talk much more about intersectionality, but I'd like to hear from some of the other panelists.
I actually love that we started with this question, and I love where my colleagues went with their answers. I think that for me, just starting in terms of my research and my own, I think it's almost impossible to be a a researcher and not cognizant of how your own, a good researcher, and not cognizant of kind of how your own identities impact how you look at things. And so for me, as somebody who also, in thinking about this intersection with sexuality and gender, as somebody who's also agender and bisexual, as well as biracial. So for me, so many of my identities are kind of in this liminal space. And that really informs the way in which I come about thinking about my research topics and the way that I approach community-based research. I'm also really committed to doing community-informed research, because I know that my own positionality isn't the only way to think about bisexuality. And so it's really important to understand the community, represent the entire community, and you can't really do that unless you have an intersectional lens. I love where we've talked about and kind of talked about identities and the intersecting identities, but the other thing that intersectionality brings up is not only the ways in which our identities intersect, but in the ways in which these larger systems of oppression intersect. And so, yes, I'm interested in how sexual orientation and race and gender identity intersect to inform my own experience and the way that I navigate the world. But I'm also interested in connecting to those larger systems of understanding how racism and biphobia and cisgenderism and all of those larger, often unexplored systems impact the way in which not only we as researchers or we as people in the community navigate, but also the larger systems of research and the powers that influence the way what research gets funded, what research gets published, the way that we ask questions, and just the way that we orient. So I think that intersectionality is such an important theoretical perspective in terms of thinking about intersecting identities, but also these intersecting systems of oppression. And I think that it was a really great way to frame not only how we as researchers think about it, but really how we as a community engage and understand ourselves in this particular moment in time, in our particular social locations, and in this particular political climate. So I'll leave it at that, but I really think this is a great way to begin, in a lot of ways, the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Paz. You brought up such a great point about our political systems. And I think what maybe many people don't know is that a lot of trans individuals identify as bi or pan. And so I would love to hear from you about that intersection. Any research or just your thoughts in general would be most appreciated.
I mean, it's true that when you're looking demographically at trans research and how trans and non-binary folks identify in terms of sexual identity, the largest proportion, and obviously the trans community is heterogeneous and can identify in multiple ways. But when you look at the demographics, most do end up choosing labels that best represent themselves, that are kind of in that bi plus plurisexual kind of label. So bisexual, pansexual, queer. And part of that is because our system of sexuality, of which bisexuality is kind of part of in this larger kind of climate, was initially conceptualized in really binary terms. And so the idea of how we label ourselves historically has to do with identifying ourselves within one binary sex and identifying those who we're attracted to within one binary sex, and then choosing a label that somehow speaks to the match of that. Well, when you are trans or non-binary, that system is already kind of thrown out of the waters. And so I think having bisexual, pansexual, bi plus pluri identities really opens up not only for trans and non-binary folks, but for all of us to think about the ways that we identify outside of the confines of this really strict binary system.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that was just so helpful to hear all those insights. And I think you know, for bi people to think it's not just a binary identity. I know this is a bit contentious, but very important to have that space to consider attraction to people of different genders. But I think coming in as somebody who's also got an interest in political science and just being aware of the, you know, the onslaught on people whose gender and sexuality differs from what's very considered to be traditional, whether that's binary or you know, heterosexual. There is a political onslaught on, you know, whole communities, and that's been focused on trans people in a very scapegoating way. And I think that it is very important for us as academics to be mindful of that, to look for ways to create spaces to tackle it, and also ways that our research can be impactful and help to support, you know, the legal and the policy structures that support trans people. Intersex people are also very impacted by this prejudice, this worldwide sort of glut of prejudice. And obviously this prejudice also makes it very hard for bi people, even if they're, you know, sort of binaried and only, you know, within that binary system, because it creates a climate of fear, and it's hard then for people to actually explore things and find community. So this is a very important time for us to be doing research around bisexuality and around kind of sexual and gender rights generally.
Yeah, I agree entirely. To sort of echo my colleagues, I think that there's a really central coalitional issue and an investment for anyone of any sort of LGBTQ identities. But there's some, you know, quite clear partnerships that I think can be made between sort of the theorization of bisexual identities and the theorization of trans and non-binary identities in terms of their relationships to gender and sort of the positioning in this sort of binary scenario which Paz outlined. But I would also speak to many of the cisgender bisexual participants or bi+ participants that I've spoken to in my research have a similarly interesting relationship with gender, in the sense of many cis people who identify as bi+ in one way or another that I have spoken to in the course of my research have stated that they don't particularly feel a very strong relationship to their gender, and some, you know, do explore non-binary expression at points, both in terms of just you know, sartorial and fashion and in terms of expectation, but also sometimes in terms of identity. So there's an interesting relationship, I think, generally between bi+ identities and gender identities that may be better conceptualized through sort of experience and feeling sometimes, rather than categorical identity. And, you know, here we're probably going to get into the problematiques of language labels and identity, which is an inherent question in bisexual studies. But I think that there's quite a compelling and rich area for further investigation in relation to the particular relationship with gender and bi identities.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for that. Let's go on to our next question, which is, in your view, has the representation of bisexual people in the media affected society's view of bisexuality itself? Any takers?
Huge.
Jump right in.
Yes, so I have a particularly strong view about representation, and I think it's sort of summarized to some extent by if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I think that really plays into representations of bi+ identities. So, you know, there's a long history of having overtly sexualized bisexual female characters on things like television and film media, and yet even with this, there's like the curse of never saying the B word, you know, so no one ever declares their bisexuality on these television shows or news programs or anything, and it's always sort of skated around and as a result eroticized to some extent. And this is you know, sort of in keeping a lot with the idea of the male gaze, you know, the heterosexual male gaze of women are to be objectified, sexualized, and more is more for men in some ways. But then there also is the increasing problem, or the ongoing problem, I should say, of a complete invisibility and absence of male bisexual representation in, you know, which is in contrast to some of these conversations where it's just not discussed or not enabled through media representations. Now, the implications of this is that you cannot claim an identity if you do not know that it is available to you. So, in my personal experience as a bisexual person, this was something that sort of plagued my opportunities to come out, was literally not seeing any kind of representation. That is also going to play into audience reception. I think that if people see these kind of interactions unnamed, unrecognized, or disregarded in one way or another, then audiences who may not tap in with a bisexual identity are going to think that way about bisexual people. There's a lot of work that's been conducted in the field of sociology that speaks about the specific influence of representation and how an audience then understands a minoritized group in one way or another. And, there's a very clear connection. So yes, I'm interested to see what my colleagues think as well.
Yeah, for me, it's interesting. As you were talking, I see all of that, and I see that kind of in the literature. And I also see a very interesting parallel in the sense that if I'm thinking about the field of research on bisexuality, it really parallels that. The fact that the research has mostly focused on cis women, and now there's a little bit more gender diversity. There's little research and focus on bisexual men. When there is, the questions tend to be very different. It's less about navigating identity. It's less about making meaning out of identity. It's more about these really essentialist questions about, do bisexual men exist? Is bisexuality real? From these very biological, essentialist kinds of viewpoints. And so I think that not only does media impact how bisexual individuals think about their identities or the possibilities of their identities, it also has really limited and impact and influenced how researchers have gone about trying to address some of these issues as well. And so I think that it becomes quite circular in some ways. If there's also not that, even if we're not even asking the questions in the research, then how does the community tend to kind of understand themselves? As one just small example, I know early on in my tenure as editor of Journal of Bisexuality, I was curating a special issue on friendships of bisexual individuals. And I was very open to kind of all approaches to it. And the only research that was being conducted on bisexual friendships was on women. And then it wasn't for years before anybody was really also looking at that for men as well. And so I think it's media, it's research, and then it's also our community and our ability to put voice to our experiences.
You're muted, my friend.
I'm so sorry. Please
There you
forgive me.
go.
So I think what we've heard today, and also what I know from when I was doing research in this area, is there's erasure in the media and also in research agendas. So often in research agendas, there's LGBT, but the bi is just kind of assumed without looking at the specific issues that bi people face, such as particular types of discrimination, such as notions around, say, not that there's anything wrong with promiscuity, but a kind of blanket assumption of promiscuity, for example, or, prejudice, like thinking that bisexuals are untrustworthy, or thinking that bisexuals are only really queer when they're with a same-sex partner, so that there are only issues that face bisexuals when they're in the same-sex relationship. I've certainly come across before when I've been doing research. We know that's not true. So there's that kind of erasure, and then there's the kind of exoticization and the, which colleagues have already talked about a bit. And I think there's another thing as well, which is that there's plenty there are plenty of people who go out and have encounters or relationships with people of different sexes who don't call themselves bisexual, and I think that's a whole sort of diaspora of people who might not identify at all with the bi community, for example, who often kind of get overlooked and left out, and are actually quite hard to access in research terms, particularly because they might be really quite closeted. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, really. So I'd like to hand back to colleagues now.
I just wanted to add on. I mean, I'm wondering if either of you think that this is changing, because there are growing media representations that are much more diversely in kind, much more sort of LGBTQ focused, that are targeted towards young people. So I'm thinking about things like Heartstopper, which has an explicitly bisexual male character. But also things, and I haven't seen the next one, Sex Education. I'm under the impression that it's a very diverse cast and sexual experiences.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious. My impression is that all of these things are growing, targeted towards young people in a very, very positive way. But at the same time, I'm wondering if it is perhaps leading to like some kind of depoliticization of identities and activism. I know that this is maybe taking us on another journey, but I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts about that as well. I'm growing my own thoughts as it stands.
I mean, I certainly think programs like sex education are very much to be welcomed. I suppose anecdotally from sort of just what I've observed amongst young people is I think in certain sections there's a lot of acceptance and fluidity, but there are also in the UK massive problems with bullying, and that includes biphobic bullying. So I think we're sort of moving out really now of considering media into other issues. I don't know if colleagues have got other things that they'd like to add.
I think you bring up a great point that as we become more visible, it does become in some ways depoliticized and a little bit more normalized. And then also there's the backlash. And so it's a both and that we're seeing kind of move through. I think that also I think about this also anecdotally as my two youngest are, like high schoolers. And so just looking at their acceptance, looking at their language, looking at the fact that it's not a big deal when people are coming out. I think that sometimes our research hasn't quite yet caught up with being sophisticated enough with capturing what that nuanced experience is right now, because we're used to, and as Surya, you'd kind of mentioned people who have attractions or even experiences, but don't label themselves that way. And I think that that's happening a lot with youth, which can be good in some ways in terms of just normalization and also not maybe mitigating some of that bullying, but also is just just allowing this kind of free expression. But as researchers, I'm also wondering, have we captured what that looks like and that generational kind of shift in the way that people might not be outwardly identifying? And how do we, and you brought this up, how do we recruit? What's the language that we use to recruit? And are our methods sophisticated enough to capture the fluidity in which I think young people are experiencing and thinking about their sexuality in a lot of ways? So those are things that I think about somewhat as a researcher in thinking about, it used to be that we were talking about invisibility and how do we capture that? And now I think it is we're still talking about some of those, but I don't know that our methods have necessarily caught up with the community. Which is why I think it's so important also to do that community-based research, be in touch with community, understand the language, understand experiences, and for me to humble myself and not approach it from my 50-year-old perspective of thinking and my vantage point in the field.
Thank you all so much. Oh, sorry. Keep going. It's a good topic.
No, I was just going to say, I really agree. And I mean, I think there will be other ways of doing research, obviously, depending on the aims and the methodology. But I think, for example, talking and interacting with young people more generally about their views on sexuality, not just targeting people identified as bi. I mean, that's a very obvious obvious thing, I know, but I think we do need to be thinking in different ways with doing research, because you know, times are changing, and I think particularly with kind of gender diversity as well. You know, some people, even though we know that the bi community uses bi as an umbrella label a lot of the time to include pansexual people and people who don't identify as any particular gender and so on, you know, non-binary people, I think it does require a bit of a shift, because you can't just, it's not as defined anymore, is it? So
just in terms of sort of the language we use to recruit participants, if we're invested in talking to people, I've actually started shifting to not using an identity label, and I think that can be really productive in terms of having that space. So it's an interesting sort of contradiction in some ways, because as a sociologist, I'm quite interested in sort of my interest is how people position themselves in relation to society. And so the identity label orientation of that is very interesting to me, in a productive mode of understanding sort of the way, you know, similar to Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology, the way in which people are literally orienting themselves to the world. But at the same time, I think that I've had really productive opportunities to engage in research as a result of having that open statement of, you know, please come and talk to me or sign up for an interview if you are attracted, whether romantically or sexually, to more than one gender. And that sort of openness, it's obviously very wordy, but it means that I've spoken to people who have identified as gay or lesbian, but still been participating in different gendered sexual behavior. I've spoken to people who are unlabeled, you know, and there's it's quite a nice way of also speaking to people who are maybe very unsure in terms of how they position themselves. So yes, it's not an ideal I don't think there is an ideal way of sort of sampling people, but I think a deliberate openness has been something I found to be quite productive in my own work to date.
Well, this segues very nicely into our next question, which is, in your opinion, what are some of the key challenges that bisexual individuals face in research and academia, particularly when it comes to visibility and recognition?
I have a good anecdote to start with, which is, you know, I think that quite frankly, a large piece of the puzzle is being taken seriously. You know, there is still a huge amount of stigma around bisexual identities, of it just being a phase, or, you know, participants being greedy in one way or another. This is a social stigma that continues to persist, which is also very present in research environments still. So, for example, when I was doing a study on bisexuality, you know, within the last few years, then the response I would get would be like, okay, go on then, tell me, is it real? And it's sort of like, I'm standing here as a bisexual researcher, researching bisexuality with a smile on my face because you're more senior than me, you know. So this is very much sort of a thing that continues to persist, is being taken seriously, being understood, and being respected as having an experience that is, I would argue, different to lesbian and gay experiences, and should be studied in its own right as such, and sort of integrated into scholarship in its own right. And actually, Surya's article on invisible bisexual scholarship was quite influential for me in this regard, and sort of charting some of these ideas that I have. So I'll pass over.
Thank you. I'm really glad, because I think as someone myself who's bisexual growing up, facing stigmatization from, in my case, particularly the lesbian community, actually, but within academia, also a certain amount of, you know, questioning and so on. And I think you really have to fight your corner, and it's difficult, actually. And I do think that it's important to have that scholarship there in the mainstream. Actually, I think it is a public sociology duty, isn't, you know, by doing this work, it's a service to the wider community, really, because, you know, even for people who are definitely straight, knowing about the fact that bisexuality exists is kind of really part of just a basic education, isn't it? You know, arguably. So yes, I think that there is real discrimination, and there's discrimination within academic settings as well. And then if you layer that on top of the increasingly homophobic and transphobic environment that we have in places like the UK, it's really quite problematic. And I think one thing that can tend to happen, and I've experienced this myself, is that I've tended to be less out about being bi because I've been fighting on a lot of other fronts, and I've kind of sacrificed that. And it's not very comfortable, actually. And I think people do have I mean, it is known that there's a psychological cost to being closeted at work, for example. I'm not closeted at work, but, you know, I might be a bit less out. And I mean, I don't know if other people have that experience as well, but I think, you know, when things get more difficult socially, people tend to be less out, don't they? And I think at the moment, unfortunately, in a lot of climates, it's getting more difficult to be out as anything that's not kind of a straight cisgender person. And maybe bi people tend to perhaps to retreat a bit, and it's a shame. But at the same time, I think we have to be strategic, don't we, about how we do our lives. And you know, I mean, I'm certainly prioritizing doing the other research that I do, because for me politically that's more important. But then I think that there's a personal cost to that.
Yeah, I really resonate with that idea of being strategic about your career and being strategic about how your identities are presented, and both in terms of how you interpersonally navigate, but also how our work is seen as legitimate. So not only are we fighting this idea of like bisexuality is not legitimate, but is bisexuality a legitimate academic topic? And so I guess this is my plug for the journal that, you know, for a long time, the Journal of Bisexuality was the place where people felt like, I mean, publishing is the currency of academia, unfortunately or fortunately, however we might want to view that. But so I think having a journal that is interdisciplinary, that does peer review, that is rigorous and uses all the hallmarks of publication, but also is showcasing the current research is something that's really important. One of the things that I've also noticed is early on, really the Journal of Bisexuality was where most people would kind of publish things. Early on, those studies were secondary analyses of larger data sets of LGBT individuals. So they weren't even studies that were designed specifically about bisexuality. It was just this one journal that, like, you have a really good data set and nobody really cares about bisexual people, so you can just submit that to Journal of Bisexuality. And I really feel like I've seen the field shifting. And so for me, that's been something that's been great to see that is growing. I see now that a lot of people are publishing outside of that journal. I also edit Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, and the amount of bi research that we're able to publish there makes me really happy. Sometimes I'm like, oh, why aren't you publishing in Journal of Bi? But I'm actually really happy that in more mainstream queer and non-queer journals, some of this research is growing, and that people are conducting research specifically by or about the bi plus population, and have been designing that. I think I think publishing, we're seeing some of that growth. I think that in terms of funding, and I'm in the US, so if we're thinking about NIH funding, NSF funding, there's not the same focus on bi population as there are for lesbian and gay, or actually even probably gender diversity and trans populations. I'm still seeing that really lag. The American Institute of Bisexuality does fund some research, but in terms of national funding, that again gives legitimacy to this as a topic, is still lacking. I'm not sure about how funding is in the UK, but I can speak to that in the US.
I think it's pretty hard to get funding for bi-specific studies. And I mean, there is another route, of course, which is to do LGBTQ+ work, but then to have a strong focus on bisexuality. But yes, I think it is difficult. I don't know what your experience is, Rosie.
I was very fortunate to have my PhD research, which was all focused on bisexuality, to be funded, and was very lucky in that regard. And since then, there has been an expectation, I think, both in myself, sort of internal pressure in myself and so on, to sort of scale up into broader LGBTQ studies, which is quite interesting. But I can't speak too much about sort of the funding landscape, being quite an early career researcher at this stage. So I haven't dabbled enough to form a fully formed opinion yet. I will say though that sort of harkening back a little bit to outness as an academic, I'm actually very how to say, I've been very supported beyond a few sort of negative reactions here and there, to feel very comfortable about sort of declaring investment in bisexuality and also a positionality as a bisexual person. What has been scarier, and is the thing that I am very strategic about, is declaring a non-binary identity, which always feels deeply fraught. But it's interesting that we have a slightly different experience in that sense, which I think is maybe just speaks to our different geographical locations, or it could be anything. But
Well, we have some incredible questions from our audience, so I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit so we can get to these. There was a lot of talk around bisexuality and decolonization. So it was mentioned earlier that bisexuality is a Western concept that doesn't resonate in all communities. What other ways is it talked about, understood, experienced in other contexts?
So I'm not sure that I'm very well equipped to answer that question, but I can point to some really excellent work that's been done. There's an edited collection, which is I think Bisexual Sexual Citizenship in Europe. It's I don't know if anyone can remember the title more clearly, but there's a chapter in there by Zeynep Peygamber Zeda, which is all about bisexual asylum stories, and it's an excellent piece of work. I think it's absolutely phenomenal, and it speaks to the fact that a lot of people who are claiming asylum on the basis of sexual or gender orientation asylum claims have to fit into a Western narrative, and have to identify with sort of bisexual, lesbian, or gay. And there's also additional complexities in there in terms of what border agents will recognize. Lesbian and gay are more recognizable and understandable than bisexual identity. So there's lots of levels of interesting problems there. But that's one chapter I would speak to, which I think has influenced my thinking quite a lot on the international implications of labels and sort of the violence they can cause to some people's experiences. But I think my colleagues might be also very well informed on this. And
Zeynep will be finishing their PhD very soon, and I really hope that there'll be some more publications coming out. I don't know if Zeynep's actually here today, but if you are, hello. And I think that these debates are really important. One thing I would point out from the literature more generally is that in for example, some of the African countries, people are using terms like queer and bi very strategically themselves. So some people will reject them as being Western originated, and some people embrace them and sometimes rework them to suit themselves. So I think it's a very fluid and, again, contextualized set of processes. I mean, the term bisexual can be very useful. That's also the case in the Indian context as well. I've read accounts from Indian people who identify as bi. People will use these labels very agentically. So I just wanted to throw that into the pot and maybe hand over to colleagues. I don't know if maybe Paz would like to speak to this as well.
To be honest, I started looking at the Q&A and I just lost the thread totally. So I have nothing to add to this at this point, because I was getting very distracted by all the amazing questions and comments in the Q&A.
Do you have a favorite? Do you want us to move on to one of the amazing questions? We have some here, but I would love to hear what captured you.
I mean, I feel like some of it, I think some of the earlier ones we started to address, like how we navigate our own biphobia in work contexts. Yeah, I was just kind of following along because they were all happening as we were talking and I hadn't looked at them yet. And so I was reliving the conversation through all of that.
Wonderful. Yeah, I have some amazing questions. So, in the same theme as decolonization, how can we work towards decolonizing Western ideas of sexuality within research and academia?
For me, I think anytime we're trying to kind of deconstruct a system, I think it's working with, and it's understanding our own biases, right? So sometimes it's first understanding where our own lenses are and finding ways to engage with that, learn, talk with others. Sometimes for me, it's even conducting research on things that I might not know much about, but I know that I need to get in there and talk to community about. And so I feel like sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And I think you have to be humble as a researcher. You have to have conversations. You have to engage with people who have different ideas, and you have to be willing to kind of learn and actually really unlearn. And so that it's really hard to say, how does that happen? Because I think we all have a different process for doing that. But I think that that's one area that if I'm being 100% honest, I'm still learning and discovering. I'm writing a chapter right now that with colleagues who are really pushing my thinking on that. And I did that intentionally because I knew those were conversations that I don't normally have, because what we tend to do is hang out with, research with, think with people who are very similar to ourselves. And so I think for me as a researcher, I've just tried to diversify my perspectives. And I think that until we all engage in that kind of cultural humility, we're not going to move very far. I think the other thing that happens and that I feel really strongly about is not only engaging with people with different perspectives, but really working to mentor the new group of folks that are coming in who have very different perspectives, who are thinking really differently, who constantly challenge me. My students are always challenging me, and I love that. And I think without that, my questions wouldn't have changed, my perspective wouldn't have changed, and ultimately the research questions I ask wouldn't have changed. And so I don't know, it's not a very concrete answer. It's a process answer to that, but that's how I think about it for my own self.
Surya, are you still here with us? Perhaps not. We may have lost our dear friend. However, Rosie, would you like to contribute anything?
Sure, I can come in on that. So it's complex, right? I think that Paz is right in terms of sort of being humble is a really central part of this. That's why I specifically say that my work is, very distinctly located in Western context, because I do not assume that it can sort of move across other spaces or speak to other sorts of experiences. In many ways, I feel sort of underqualified to respond to this question, because I think that hearing from people working on the field of sexuality and gender in other places and other institutions should sort of be the leading voices. And that I see sort of my position in that conversation as being one of listening, paying close attention, trying to find those conversations and threads, because we're consistently sort of push towards conversations coming from Western institutions, high-ranking, wealthy universities and so on. So trying to sort of find those conversations is a big piece of of the work, and then trying to sort of amplify them and do, what we call feminist citational practices. That tends to relate to sort of amplifying other feminists and women's work. But I think that there's an important piece in terms of practicing good citational practices in terms of global scholarship. I think it's challenging and difficult because that's not where a lot of academic conversations lead us. But I think it's quite central to this entire process.
I'm sorry, I
Go
actually
ahead.
I dropped out for a minute. Is it okay just to jump back in?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks for your patience with my tech. I'd just like to go back to the conversation about decolonisation, and just to say that I really loved what you were saying, Paz, and I really echo all and resonate with all of that. And what I wanted to add is I think also it's also about knowledge. So it's understanding that the gender and sex and sexuality categories that we have within the West, and obviously given the colonial dominance of the West that are now international, are just that, they're constructs. And the idea that there's a division between heterosexuality and non-heterosexuality is a Western construct. It's fictitious, and it's deeply implicated in the way that colonization and imperialism and capitalism were developed. And so there's that. And then there's understanding and starting to reach out and look at all the work of people in the global South, amazing intellectuals, which I think often that work is not heard in the West and the global North. And the other thing I think is actively looking for opportunities to collaborate with some of those people, whether that's academics or activists or both, and looking for ways to leverage funding, because it's very, there's a big inequality between funding that's available in the global North and the global South often. And so I suppose for those of us, and I'm sure that our audience are international, but for those of us who are in the global North and the West who have the capacity to do so, because we've maybe got a possibility, I think it's a really great thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, we have more questions. So how can we conduct studies that compare sexuality? Do we need categories by heterosexual, homosexual, or does this reduce the complexity of sexuality?
A fantastic question. I think this is the the constant question that drives a lot of sexuality scholars is to label or not. I think that I position myself in more of a queer theoretical school. So queer theory, for those who may not be familiar, actively tries to subvert and step away from identities in many ways, and sort of look at it exactly in that way, as experiential, like a glut of experiences that are all entangled and reliant on one another in many ways. And I see that as a very productive theoretical space. However, when I'm thinking about the implications of my work and sort of the potential influence on policy, or the potential opportunity to act as a role model, or even for people to see that there is work in existence that relates to people's identities, I also find it important to name and label identities. And that's why I tend towards using sort of bi plus as my overarching umbrella descriptor to try and embrace some of that queer complexity, and embrace some of that sort of experiential messiness, but ultimately still position itself as speaking to a certain group of people with certain experiences who may very strongly identify with sorts of labels. So in answer to comparing and contrasting, I think it can be productive depending on the question that you're trying to ask. If it's sort of towards something based in quote unquote real life of like changing policy or acting as media representation, it can be very helpful to name, but otherwise I think that there's a very rich productivity to just melting the pot.
I think I just wanted to raise a very small point, which is that for quantitative research, for example, surveys, you do need boxes, you need the categories, and it's finding categories then that speak as inclusively as possible to people. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that conversation is it really depends on why you're doing the research and who, what the outcomes are. So for sometimes it is important to have the categorization if we're thinking about health disparities, because even if we understand, and I understand identity to be a construct and think about these identities kind of provisionally as categories, but they do shape the realities of bi folks. And so as a psychologist, I do a lot of research from kind of a health disparity, minority stress standpoint. And so being able to make some comparisons and show that there are some ways that biphobia impacts bi folks differently, and there are unique stressors that you experience that are different from those that somebody who are folks that are monosexual might experience. I think that then does become important, not only for again, positioning those identity categories, but also for understanding the larger construct of the oppressive system, understanding how biphobia works very differently than heterosexism, understanding how biphobia might intersect very uniquely with racism in a way that is different from other experiences. So again, I think it's it's both. You kind of have to. And I think that depending on the question that I ask, I think about those labels very differently. I think about whether or not it makes sense to compare bi people to kind of a more normative group. Sometimes that's very problematic, and sometimes that's strategic if you're trying to show health disparities, trying to get money to develop interventions that are very specific for bi folks that are so, and I kind of straddle doing work that is both from an understanding negotiation of identity and understanding these lived realities and psychological outcomes. I also straddle this sense of doing qualitative research and quantitative research. And so often the ways that I think about categorizing or asking these demographics really differ in terms of what is it that I plan to do with that data. How do but in all cases, I want to make sure that I am, even if I'm asking these very categorical questions, I still understand that group has a lot of diversity within it, and I'm asking questions that still allow me to not reduce people to a particular label and to elevate kind of the diversity of experiences of my participants. So it's a constant tension. And I think it's just something that you have to understand, not only your positionality and we've been talking about this a lot, our positionality as researchers and our identities, but our own theoretical perspectives and what it is that we're hoping to do with that data in terms of bettering the bi community.
Well, I don't know about you, but this time flew for me. So we only have a little bit of time left. Would everyone like to go around and share their parting words, a final thought for our audience?
I'm just really pleased we were able to have this conversation. I think there's often not a space given for bi-specific conversations, and to be able to have this chat with two people who I find to be very influential in, sort of the way that I've been thinking around these topics has been a real pleasure. So thank you. It's been so good to talk to you.
I would completely second that. It's been really, really nice connecting and exploring some of these issues, and it's reignited my passion, my passion for this field. And, I just really encourage anyone who's out there who's either working in this field or might be bi or pansexual themselves, or, encourage people, because we really need more research and we need more people working in this kind of area. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been great to be in community with everybody. And I think that being an academic is also very isolating at times. And so having these kinds of conversations, and normally I find myself thinking about these things a lot, but not really being able to be in conversation, except for maybe people in my team. So this has just been really lovely. I think the only other thing that, as we've been talking about positionality, I just want us to think a little bit about how this conversation would be really different if we had had different researchers here. Who is here, and that's important, and we've all established our location, but who is left out of the conversation right now, and how differently the conversation would have been. And that's nothing about, you know, who put the panel together. It's just a reality of any three researchers that you might have, the conversation might go differently. And so I'm really feel very grateful to get to be part of this conversation. And I'm thinking about all of the people who I'd love to hear kind of their thoughts on and answers to these questions as well. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you all so much for your time today, your great insights, your discussion, and thank you to everyone who gave us these amazing questions. We will send a follow-up email with the recording and any resources that were mentioned today during our chat. So if you didn't get it down, follow up in the email. We'll have it there for you. All right, everyone, thank you so much for your time, and we'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.